Hey everybody, welcome to Bill Sky the Linux Guy, and what we're going to be talking about today are super users. A super user is an administrative user, and it's really the way that all professional Linux administrators, server administrators for that matter, think you should or believe that you should be administrating your Linux operating system. You shouldn't be using the root user, which is what we're going to talk about that as well, because it's an all-powerful user that can literally destroy the entire operating system in a single command. So they don't want you doing that, but they do want you using a what they call a sudo user, sudo. And if you looked at my previous video on how to update your operating system in Linux, you'll notice that I use the command sudo, which stands for super user do. At least that's what I think it means. Might mean something else, but that's actually what it is. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you how to set that up, how you use it. So let's get right to the Linux. So one thing I want to show you right now, I am on Mint Linux, and what I would like to do, I'd like to switch over to a version of Ubuntu that really doesn't have any, it's only got one user set up, Linux user, and this is Ubuntu 23.10, and you can see Mint behind it because I'm using VMware. The only user ID that's shown is Linux user, and for those of you who don't know this, there's a user ID on Linux called root, and root is the all-powerful administrator, can do anything on the operating system. I mean anything. It can even get to user personal files. It's just the master user, and all professional administrators that I know say don't use root. Have root set you up as a super user, and then you can do your administrative stuff like updating the system, installing applications, and maybe even managing users. But I'm showing you Ubuntu right here because I'm going to click this not listed link, and I'm going to type the word root, and I'm going to type just some password, and Ubuntu doesn't even let you do this. Now, you might see here that it did ask me for a password, but if I type in a password, if root does have a password, Ubuntu's not going to let me do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log into Linux user, and Linux user is a sudoer. It is a super user. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to open up a terminal, and I'm going to set the password for root, because root in Ubuntu normally does not have a password assigned to it. Most Debian Linuxes do not. So I'm going to say I have to say sudo. So as super user, I want to do something. I want to set the password for root. I'm going to press enter. It's going to ask me for my current password, for my Linux user password. It's now going to ask me for the password for root. And now root has a password. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log off. And you can't really see this. So I'm just going to log off of my Ubuntu, and I'm going to try to re-log in, this time as root. Now notice root now has a password, but they're still not listed. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to click type root, and even though I typed in a correct password, it won't let me do it. It will not let me log in as root. And that's how serious root is considered to Ubuntu, is that they don't even want you logging into it. So now other operating systems like Alma Linux, in fact, if I go to Alma Linux or CentOS or Red Hat, I'm going to go into Linux user. And there's another thing that you can do in Linux, which is the switch user, so the SU. So I want to switch my user to, there it is. So I'm going to switch my user. So SU stands for switch user. I'm going to switch my user to root. And now I'm actually in the root ID. You can see before I switched user, I was in Linux user, but now I'm in root. Now I can literally do anything I want. And you can also do this in Ubuntu, but you can also log in to the GUI using root in Alma, Red Hat, and CentOS. And I typed exit to get out of root. I do not like being in root. I'm going to exit there. I'm going to go up here and I'm going to log out. And GNOME is not showing me, GNOME is the graphic user interface, it's not showing me root, but it should let me log in. And now I'm logged in as root. This is extremely dangerous. They never want you to do it. In fact, it even says you're running as a specialized user. So it's really not a good idea to do that. And I'm going to log out as quickly as I can. Okay. So I'm going to go back over, oh, that was interesting. I have never noticed that. It looks like in Alma Linux, once you log in as root, it shows you root. Now, one important thing to remember is Red Hat, CentOS, and Alma Linux, when you set up your operating system, they actually ask you to set up the password for root. So they see the importance of using root, but not for everybody. So I really would stay away from root. So I'm on Mint Linux here, and Mint Linux is basically a Debian Linux. And just like with any other Linux, the password command, I can type password, or you have to type sudo. Well, actually, let's do that. Let's say password root. It says you may not view or modify password information. So I'm going to say sudo password root, and I type in my password. I type in the new password for root twice, and now I can log into password. So I'm going to say switch user to root, type in the password, and now very, very dangerously, I'm inside of root. So it's actually not a good idea to be logged in as root. Sometimes you can, right? Like if I'm going to say apt update, notice I don't have to put the sudo in front of it. It's going to go ahead and update everything. And right now everything is up to date because I updated it today. So I don't have to put the word sudo in front of it. But it's still not something that people really like to set up or to use as root. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a new ID, and I'm going to show you how you can make that ID an administrator. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to type in users and groups. Now there is a command to do this, but we're going to do it in the GUI. And I'm going to add a new ID. Now the only reason I'm allowed to do this is because I am considered a super user. I'm not root, but I'm considered a super user. So I type in my password, and I'm going to call this one guest user. And down here, the username, I always like to use the full, so guest user. And I'm going to click OK. It asks me for a password. I can generate a random password, or I can say, I can have the user type in one on their own, which is actually not a bad idea, but I'm going to put in a new password. So this is for guest user. So now guest user. Now, I do not believe I set this up as an administrator. So when I went into settings, I didn't set them up as an administrator at all. They really can't do anything here. They're not an administrator. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of that. I'm going to close, and now I'm going to log out and log back in. I'm going to log in as guest user. There's guest user in my login. Type my password. Now my resolution is kind of low because I'm a brand new user, so I'm going to right click on this. And actually no, I have to go into settings. So I'm going to say displays. There's my displays. And I'm going to change the resolution. It's actually kind of neat that we're doing this because you can see that every user has their own setup. Okay, we're going to keep that. Okay, so now I'm going to go into the terminal and I'm going to try to update the system. So I'm going to say sudo apt update. Now remember, I'm not considered a super user. Ask me for my password. It says, sorry, guest user is not allowed to execute. Sometimes they'll even log, I think it might even be logged that I tried to do that. So if I'm on a Linux system and there is an administrator seeing that I'm trying to do sudo commands, but I really can't do anything. If I go to home, and if I change to my directory Linux user, it won't even let me change to the directory Linux user because it's really secure. Linux is super secure. But let's say I would like to make this user an administrator. Now I can switch user to Linux user because Linux user is a super user. I'm going to type in the password. So now I'm logged in as Linux user. You can see it right there. I'm logged in as Linux user. And I would actually like to add guest user as a super user. I would like to allow them to do that. So what I'm going to do as Linux user, now I could have logged out of guest user and logged back into Linux user, but this way I just changed, switched user to Linux user. I'm going to use the nano program, which is a nice little editor. So I'm going to say sudo nano etc sudoers. And sudoers is basically a list of all the super users. Okay, so I am in the sudoers file, and you can see it's a very cryptic file. A lot of things in Linux are cryptic files, and there's a number of things that you can do here. I could add guest user to the group admin. Now, we haven't talked too much about users and groups yet, but every user is part of a group, and I could create a group. In this case, there's an admin group. There's also a pseudo group, which I could add the guest user into that group. And that probably would not be the worst thing to do. In fact, that probably be a very good idea to do, is to go ahead and move them to that group. And we're going to talk about that. But I could also add them manually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type guest user all equals all. And now I've added that user to the guest users file, or to the sudoers file. Now I haven't saved this file yet, and guest user would have to log out and log back in. But let's talk a little bit about what this is. So guest user, that's the user ID. All means, this first all right here means that that user can run all commands as any user in the system from any host computer. So I could be logged in from remotely, I could be logged in locally. The syntax of this, I'm not really crazy about it, but that is the syntax. Okay, so I'm in my editor here, so I'm going to press Control X on my keyboard and say yes, unmodified, and press enter. I'm going to exit out as Linux user, exit out as guest user, and I'm going to go ahead and log out and log back in. Okay, so back in as guest user. And now we're going to see what we can do. Can I issue sudo commands? So I'm going to bring up the terminal. I'm going to say sudo apt update, password. Voila, I am now a super user. I now have the ability to install applications. I don't know, let's do a sudo apt search speed crunch, one of my favorite calculators. And there it is. I'm going to say sudo apt install speed crunch. And, oh, was it already in there? It's already installed. Oh my goodness. Let's try Genie. Oh, the Genie I think is already installed. Yep, Genie's already installed. So it looks like that I had already installed that, but I could have done it myself. And then that application would then be available to anybody on the operating system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log out, and I'm going to log out a guest user, and I'm going to log back into Linux user. So there's Linux user. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's create another user, users and groups, and I'm going to create another user called guest user 2. And let's make this username guest user. Now you might wonder, what's the difference between name and username? Well, the name is what's displayed. It's kind of like a more formal first name, last name thing. And the username is more of an operating system name. So, and normally it doesn't have any spaces in it. So I'm going to go ahead and create that user, give them a password. So there's my guest user 2. Now, what I would like to do is I would like to give them access to be a sudoer without actually having to add them to the sudoers file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a sudo nano etc sudoers. And there's two things I can do here. I can add them just as I did with guest user, or I could add them to the admin, or I can add them to the sudo, okay, to the sudo group. So that's actually what I want to do. And notice it has a % in front of that name, admin and sudo, and that stands for group. So I want to add them to the sudo group. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to say sudo usermod -a-g. I want to add them to the sudo group, and I'm going to say guest user 2. Now you might ask, what is the A and the G? Well, I'm going to search for that. I'm going to say man user mod. Now man is a manual pages application that's on almost all Linuxes as far as I know. And you can take a look at what those arguments mean. So -a means append, add the user to the supplementary groups. It means just add them to the group. And capital G, and where is capital G? Capital G, a list of supplementary groups which the user is also a member of. So basically what that means is it means add them to the group sudo, leave them in their other groups. So that's just the standard way that you execute that command. So now guest user 2 is now a sudo user. So I'm going to exit. Actually, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to switch user to guest user 2, log in. Now this is the first time I've been logged in as guest user 2. I didn't log into the GUI. I could have. And I'm going to say sudo apt search g++. Now, because I did that user mod, because I added guest user 2 to the sudo group, was it the sudo? Yeah, the sudo group. Now I can execute commands. I don't like adding users to the admin group because they have more capabilities, but I add them to the sudo group and now they can access those commands. So if you don't believe me, I can go ahead and exit out of there. I'm going to log out. I'm going to log in as guest user 2. Because this is the first time I've logged in using the GUI, I'm going to go in and change the display resolution. And I only have to do that once. Okay, so now you can see I'm guest user 2. I'm going to say sudo apt update. Great. Now you can see that I was able to execute that command. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a nano. I'm going to delete the entry for guest user because you really don't want to add separate users to the sudoers file anymore, especially when you've got groups. So I'm going to remove that. Now guest user is not logged in. I'm logged in as guest user 2. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say sudo usermod -a-g sudo guest user. And guest user was the one I just took out of the sudoers file. So I'm going to exit. I'm going to log off. I'm going to log back in as guest user. And this is really the preferred way to do that. Add the user to the appropriate group within the sudoers file. And I want to see, do I still have access? Sudo apt update. I certainly do. I still have access to those features to be able to do sudo commands. Now again, at any time I can switch user to root if I want. I even believe if I just say switch user dash, it takes me into root as well. So again, you don't really want to do that. The only time I ever use the root ID is when I've messed up my Linux and I need to go in and change file permissions and things like that. So it's actually a very good idea to not do that. Now, because guest user is also a super user, I'm going to go here into the GUI program and go into users and groups. And under account type for, let's say, guest user 2, and actually, what am I logged in as? Am I logged in? I'm logged in as guest user. So for guest user 2, if I want to change their account type, I can make him just a desktop user. I can make him an administrator. I could make him a custom, which is basically by putting him in the sudo file. So this is a sudo group. So this is another way to do it. If I want to make guest user 2 to be a desktop only, and I'm currently logged in as guest user, I believe. Let me make sure. Yep, guest user. So I'm going to log off and log back in as guest user 2. Remember, I just modified them. Let's see if I can do sudo statements any longer. Yep, can't do it. So you can do it via the command line or you can do it via the GUI. It's not as flexible as doing it via the GUI, but for basic administrative capabilities, it'll work. Now, the other thing about this is that if you use the terminal, you can actually write a script, which we'll be doing in this video. You can actually write a script to actually create hundreds of users with a single script run. You don't have to sit there and type every single command. So very, very useful, and we'll be getting to that very quickly in this video, in this course. All right, so that's a quick overview of super users. That's a quick overview of the root user ID. Again, everybody recommends never, ever, ever log in as root unless it's really necessary and you really know what you're doing. Go ahead and request super user access from your administrator if you're logging in remotely or if you're even on your own computer that has Linux installed. Be very careful with root. You got to be very careful with sudo as well. And I'll tell you, I'm going to show you something here. And I could actually switch user to root. This is how dangerous it is. And I could say remove fr/. rm is the delete. R is recovery, is recursive, and F is force. What this would do, and it's not going to ask me, are you sure you want to do it? What this is going to do is delete the entire operating system. I could not do that as a user, but I can do it as root. All right, super users, root, how to set that up, how to use them. Hope to see you in our next Linux video.